Hi, I'm Alison Thomas, and this is my final exam part 2 on how did the white Southerners justify slavery. So, white Southerners justified slavery through a variety of arguments. They often claimed that slavery was a positive good, arguing that it was beneficial for both slaves and the masters that owned them, and they asserted that the African Americans were inherently inferior and that slavery provided them with care and guidance that they couldn't achieve on their own. Additionally, they used economic arguments because the South was mainly focused on the agricultural aspect of the economy, and they basically stated that the Southern economy depended on slave labor because of being agriculturally developed. And some also used religious justifications, interpretations from the Bible in a way that they believed sanctioned slavery, and these justifications were used to defend and perpetuate the institution of slavery despite the growing opposition from abolitionists and the moral arguments against it. So to go in more detail about the beneficial for both slaves and masters, the white Southerners thought that the slavery was good for African Americans as they were being housed, fed, and cared for. And white Southerners argued that slavery was beneficial for both slaves and masters because through several points, they claimed that slaves were provided with food, shelter, and care, which they believed slaves couldn't secure on their own. And this paternalistic view suggested that slaves were better off under the guidance and protection of their masters. For the masters, slavery was seen as a beneficial because it provided a steady and cheap labor force essential for the economic prosperity of the Southern agricultural economy, and particularly in the production of cash crops like cotton and tobacco. And these arguments were used to rationalize and defend the institutions of slavery despite its inherent moral and ethical issues. So they thought that African Americans benefited because white Southerners believed that African Americans couldn't live on their own. They thought that they weren't smart enough and put stereotypes onto them. And they viewed African Americans as inherently inferior, both intellectually and morally, and incapable of managing their own lives without white oversight. This belief was part of the paternalistic justification for slavery, where they argued that enslaved people needed guidance and protection of their masters to survive. And this perspective ignored the autonomy, resilience, and capabilities of African Americans and served to rationalize the continuation of slavery. So, how it helped the South's economy? Slavery helped the South's economy because it was heavily based on the agricultural aspect, and a good economy means more money, so they thought using slaves was a good way to make money without basically having to work for it because they just employ slaves. And slavery did help the South's economy, particularly in the agricultural sector. The Southern economy was heavily reliant on the production of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar, which required a large labor force, and enslaved people provided this labor at minimal cost because they didn't know, and allowing plantation owners to produce these crops on a massive scale and generate significant profits from it. Their wealth generated from slave labor was a major economic driver in the South, making slavery a deeper entrenched institution. However, it's important to recognize that this economic benefit at a human cost and was built on the exploitations and suffering of millions of enslaved individuals. So the plummet of the South's economy. After slavery was abolished, the Southerners had to find ways to take care of their plantations, and they began to pay African Americans for their labor and also sharecropping. So, after slavery ended, the Southern economy underwent significant changes. The abolition of slavery meant that the South lost its primary source of cheap labor, which had been a backbone of its agricultural economy. Plantation owners had to adapt by hiring freed African Americans and poor whites as laborers, and often through sharecropping and tenant farming systems. These systems were exploitative and kept many workers in a cycle of debt and poverty, but they were less efficient than the previous slave labor systems. So, additionally, the South struggled to diversify its economy, and while the agriculture remained important, there was a slow shift towards industrialization and urbanization, and the lack of infrastructure and investments, coupled with the devastation from the Civil War, made economic recovery very difficult. And over time, the industries such as textiles and manufacturing began to develop, but the South remained economically behind the North for many years. And the end of slavery also led to significant social changes. Social changes, including the rise of segregation and discriminatory laws aimed to maintaining white supremacy. So, the end, even though white Southerners tried to justify slavery, these reasons were not good enough, and this argument led to the Civil War, and which ultimately led to the South losing anyways. And even though slavery was abolished, African Americans couldn't just start a new life because they didn't have the money to supply that. So they were basically stuck working in the fields anyways. They were just getting paid like more than they had been, if they were even getting paid to begin with. So it basically started a cycle until they could start providing for themselves.